The letter arrived on a cold February morning in 1943. Eleanor Reed had been pouring coffee at a diner near Chicago's Union Station when she saw the recruitment poster out the window. A woman in uniform, her chin lifted, eyes bright. "You serve your country. Join the Women's Army Corps." She didn't think much of it at first. She was 22, with grease under her nails and the smell of coffee in her clothes. But that night, when she counted her tips under a flickering lamp, the poster stayed in her mind. Her brothers were both overseas, one in North Africa, one somewhere in the Pacific. Every letter from them smelled faintly of smoke and sea salt. Eleanor wanted to do more than wait for their handwriting. A week later, she was standing in line at a recruitment office with 20 other women. Some wore heels, some wore work boots. The officer behind the desk handed her a clipboard and said, "Sign here, Corporal to be." His smile was kind but surprised, as if he hadn't expected so many women to answer the call. Training was harder than she'd imagined. Fort Des Moines, Iowa, was cold and muddy that spring. The WAC recruits learned to march, to salute, to break down and reassemble typewriters the way men learned to strip rifles. They drilled in formation, their breath misting in the dawn, their voices sharp as any sergeant's bark. Some came from cities, some from farms, but all of them learned to move as one. They were soldiers, though the world didn't quite believe it yet. Eleanor's roommate was a girl from Georgia named Ruthie Lang, a mechanic with hands strong enough to twist bolts and a laugh that filled the barracks. Ruthie could fix anything, trucks, jeeps, even generators, and she often said, "If they'd let us closer to the front, we'd keep those boys moving all the way to Berlin." The others would laugh, but not too loudly. They knew she was right. By summer, Eleanor was assigned to a communications unit headed for England. The Atlantic crossing was rough, the sea heaving under gray skies, but when the transport ship reached Liverpool, the sight of British rooftops and blackout curtains made it real. They were part of the war now. The women were given quarters near a massive airfield where B-17s thundered overhead day and night. Their job was to decode incoming field reports and coordinate supply lines between bases, the invisible web that kept the Allied machine alive. Days bled into nights. They worked in small wooden huts lined with radios, cables, and humming machines. The air smelled of ink and ozone. Messages came in bursts of static, coordinates, weather reports, casualty lists. Eleanor learned to type so fast her fingers blurred. She didn't wear makeup anymore. There was no time. Her hands were ink-stained, her hair pulled back tight beneath her cap. Sometimes, when bombers didn't come back, silence filled the hut like smoke. The airmen would nod to them before takeoff. Young faces, confident smiles. Hours later, their names would come through in thin carbon copies. Ruthie once said quietly, "We're fighting with wires instead of bullets." It was true. Every message, every correction, every word they sent out could mean a convoy saved or lost. In early 1944, Eleanor was transferred to London. The Blitz was long over, but the war still breathed down the city's neck. She worked in the basement of an old government building where the walls were thick with chalk marks and maps covered in colored pins. At night, she walked through the darkened streets with Ruthie, who had been reassigned nearby. The sound of distant anti-aircraft guns sometimes echoed over the Thames. Londoners still ducked their heads at the noise, then carried on, because carrying on was what everyone did. Then came June, D-Day, the day they'd trained and waited for without knowing it. In the early hours of June 6th, the radio room buzzed like a beehive. Reports from Normandy poured in faster than they could log them. The women worked 16 hours straight, faces pale under the dim bulbs, relaying coded transmissions to forward units. Eleanor didn't eat, didn't rest. Her hands trembled over the typewriter keys. One message came through half-garbled. "Beachhead secured, heavy casualties, need supplies, urgent." She looked at the smudged ink and whispered, "Hold on." For 3 days, she barely slept. The world had shifted. When it finally slowed, she and Ruthie walked along the Thames again. The sky was bruised with smoke, and ships crowded the river like steel whales. "We did it," Ruthie said softly. "We actually did it." But her voice cracked on the last word. That summer, Eleanor's unit followed the front through France. They set up mobile communications posts behind advancing divisions, sleeping in tents, eating cold rations, and sending out messages that guided the endless movement of men and machines. She saw war-torn villages, children who stared wide-eyed at the American flags painted on trucks. Once, she passed a field of wrecked tanks still smoldering in the sun. A soldier beside her muttered, "We got through because of your girls." She didn't know what to say. By the time winter came and the Battle of the Bulge froze Europe, the women worked by lantern light in makeshift command posts, shivering under their uniforms. Sometimes artillery echoed miles away, a dull heartbeat in the distance. Eleanor wrote home when she could. Her mother kept every letter. In one of them, she wrote, "We're not heroes, Ma, but the boys couldn't move without us." Maybe that's enough. When the war finally ended in 1945, London erupted in celebration. People danced in the streets, strangers kissed, and music filled the air again. Eleanor and Ruthie watched from a balcony, the crowd roaring below them. "Can you believe it's over?" Ruthie asked. Eleanor smiled faintly. It won't ever really be over. She was right. When she returned to the States, the parades were loud, the cheers sincere, but the uniforms went into closets, and the women went back to jobs they'd left behind. Some were told, kindly but firmly, that the army didn't need them anymore. The world was ready to move on, though it never would have without them. Years later, Eleanor stood in a museum in Washington, D.C., looking at an exhibit on the Women's Army Corps. Behind glass was a typewriter just like hers, its keys worn smooth. Beside it was a photo of a dozen women in uniform, smiling under the caption, "They served so others could fight." She felt something catch in her throat. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself. Older now, silver hair pinned neatly, the faintest trace of ink still on her fingers from a lifetime of typing. For a moment, she thought of Ruthie, of the airmen who never came back, of the nights when the world depended on a single line of code correctly transmitted. As she turned to leave, she noticed a young girl standing nearby, staring at the same display. The girl's mother said softly, "They were the first. They showed what women could do." The girl nodded, eyes wide. "They were brave," Eleanor smiled. "They were," she said quietly. "Brave and busy." Outside, the wind carried faint echoes of old engines and static. The ghost song of wires, of words that had once stitched together a world at war. The Women's Army Corps, the nurses, the mechanics, the cryptographers. They had all worked in the shadows of history, yet their light had never gone out. They proved that strength wasn't always found on the front lines. Sometimes it was behind them, in the hands of women who held the world together one keystroke, one bandage, one message at a time. And though their war had ended, their legacy never did. It lived on in every uniform that fit a woman's shoulders, in every command post where her voice gave orders, and in every generation that learned courage wasn't a man's inheritance, but a human one. Somewhere in a drawer, an old typewriter rested silent, its ribbon long dry. But if you pressed a key, just one, you might almost hear it hum to life again, spelling out the same truth they carried through every long night of that terrible, necessary war. They served, they endured, and they changed everything. Years later, the world Eleanor Reed had known had become sepia in memory. But its echoes were still alive in unexpected places. It was 1951, and she found herself walking across the grounds of Fort Lee, Virginia, now working as a civilian typist for the Army Quartermaster Corps. The war had ended 6 years ago, yet traces of it lingered everywhere. In the worn barracks, in the cadence of marching boots, and in the way veterans still stood a little straighter when the flag rose. The Women's Army Corps had not disappeared, not entirely. New recruits wore the same khaki, but now their presence no longer drew double takes. They were officers, administrators, radio operators, things Eleanor's generation had only dreamed of being. She sometimes gave small talks to new WIC trainees, telling them about England, about the coded messages, about the endless hum of radios during D-Day. They listened with wide eyes, leaning forward in their chairs. One of them, a bright girl named Carolyn, once asked, "Didn't you ever wish you'd been closer to the fighting?" Eleanor smiled, thinking of Ruthie's words years before. "We were close enough to hear it," she said softly. "Close enough to feel it." She hadn't seen Ruthie in nearly a decade. After the war, Ruthie had gone back to Georgia, married a mechanic, and opened a small garage that fixed everything from tractors to school buses. They still wrote, long letters filled with grease stains and laughter. In one, Ruthie had written, "Sometimes the old sounds come back to me. The engines, the typewriters, the clatter of boots. I reckon that's the sound of knowing we mattered." Eleanor kept that letter folded in her wallet, until it yellowed with time. In 1953, she attended the dedication of a new memorial in Washington honoring women in military service. It was smaller than the grand monuments nearby, but to her, it was the most important. The air was crisp, and a band played softly in the distance. Rows of women stood in uniform, WACs, waves, spars, and nurses, representing every branch that had once opened its doors reluctantly and then couldn't imagine closing them again. Eleanor stood among them, her posture still straight, her heart full. A general gave a speech that day. He spoke of logistics, communication, medicine, and code-breaking, all the hidden veins of the war effort that had kept the army alive. Behind every victory, he said, stood 1,000 women whose names history will never know. But we know, and we remember. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt tears she didn't try to hide. After the ceremony, she wandered to the edge of the reflecting pool. A few WAC veterans sat on a bench, trading memories like trading cards, barracks pranks, stolen dances, messages sent under blackout lamps. One of them turned to Eleanor. "You were in England, right?" she asked. "I think I remember your face from Des Moines." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Everyone remembers Des Moines," she said. They all laughed softly, and for a moment, it was 1943 again. The sound of boots on gravel, the smell of cold rain, the thrill of being young and useful in a world on fire. In the years that followed, Eleanor watched the quiet revolution her generation had started grow roots. When women were allowed to serve permanently in the regular Army and Navy in 1948, she'd clipped the newspaper article and pinned it to her kitchen wall. Later, when the Air Force appointed its first female officers, she felt something inside her settle, a quiet pride, as if the world had finally caught up to what she and Ruthie had always known. By the 1960s, her own daughter Grace had enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps. The night before she shipped out for Vietnam, Grace sat with her mother on the porch. "I guess I'm following your footsteps," she said, trying to sound brave. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You're making your own," she replied. "Mine are just somewhere under the mud." Grace laughed, then hugged her mother tight. When the letters began arriving from Southeast Asia, written in her daughter's looping hand, stained with humidity and exhaustion, Eleanor felt the same ache her mother must have felt in 1943, yet she also knew what that kind of service did to a person. It taught them to see the world in layers, the beauty, the grief, the duty that stitched them together. Decades later, as an old woman, Eleanor visited Arlington National Cemetery. She moved slowly, a cane in one hand, a small bouquet in the other. She stopped before a modest headstone inscribed simply, "Ruth Lang, Women's Army Corps, 1920, 1978. The marble was cool under her fingertips. "You were right," she whispered. "We could have gone all the way to Berlin." The wind carried her words away, rustling the nearby flags. That night, she stayed in a small hotel overlooking the Potomac. From her window, she could see the faint lights of the Pentagon across the river, a building that hadn't even existed when she enlisted. Inside it now worked thousands of women in uniform and out, commanding divisions, analyzing intelligence, leading operations across the world. She thought of the old typewriter, of the first message she'd ever sent across the Atlantic, and smiled. War had changed. The world had changed, but the courage that began in those muddy barracks in Des Moines had never gone out. It had only multiplied, carried forward in new names and new uniforms. The next morning, she wrote one final letter to the Department of the Army, requesting her personnel file and any record of her unit. "Not for myself," she wrote, "for the young women who will never know how it started." When she died quietly in her sleep 2 years later, that letter was still on her desk, next to a photograph of her and Ruthie standing in front of a radio tent in France, grinning at the camera with their sleeves rolled up and their hair tied back. A few months after her funeral, the Army sent a package to her daughter. Inside was a folder stamped declassified. It contained commendations, rosters, and a faded document listing Eleanor's wartime role in the 6700 WWII Communications Detachment. For meritorious service in direct support of Allied operations, European theater. Grace held it for a long time. Then she placed it on a shelf beside her own medals, whispering, "You were never behind the lines, Mom. You were the lines." Outside, the morning sun lit the medals until they shimmered like old Morse code. Dots and dashes, messages still crossing time, carrying the quiet voices of women who had once held a world together with typewriters, courage, and unshakable will. And though no trumpet ever played for them, their music had already changed the world. One key, one message, one heartbeat at a time. It was spring of 1995, and the air around Arlington carried that same faint hum of memory, a stillness between the trees that seemed to breathe with the past. Captain Sarah Lang of the United States Army stood near Section 46, her uniform pressed, her medals modest. She was Ruthie's granddaughter, though she'd never met her. She had grown up on stories, fragments really, told by her mother about 2 women who once worked radios in a muddy tent somewhere in France, who typed messages that saved convoys and whispered courage into wires. For years, those names, Eleanor and Ruthie, had sounded almost mythical to her. Now she was here, the granddaughter of a WAC, part of a new army where women commanded tanks, flew helicopters, and led platoons into combat zones. Yet, even surrounded by progress, Sarah felt the weight of history pressing gently on her shoulders. She knelt at her grandmother's grave and traced the carved letters, the same way her great-grandmother once had. "They told me you fixed trucks," she murmured. "Guess I fixed satellites." She smiled at the thought, a bridge of steel and signals spanning 50 years. That week, she had been assigned to a special project at the Pentagon, digitizing old personnel records from World War II. Boxes of faded folders filled the office, the paper fragile and brown with time. She didn't think much of it until she saw a name she recognized. "Reed, Eleanor M." She froze, the breath catching in her throat. The file was thin but carefully preserved. Inside was a photograph. 2 women in uniform, arms around each other, both grinning, one with a wrench in her hand, the other with a typewriter balanced on her lap. On the back, in fading ink, France, 1944. Ruthie and Ellie, still alive somehow. Sarah sat back slowly, feeling a rush of something she couldn't quite name. Pride, sorrow, wonder. She requested the rest of the 6711th Communications Detachment files. For weeks, she combed through dispatches, commendations, telegrams. Piece by piece, the story of those forgotten women came alive again. She read about their round-the-clock decoding shifts during D-Day, their field assignments in liberated France, their citations for sustained excellence in communications under hostile conditions. It wasn't just history anymore. It was family. One evening, she stayed late, the office quiet except for the hum of scanners. Outside, the Pentagon lights glowed faintly across the river. Sarah found a single unsigned letter tucked in the back of Eleanor's file. The handwriting was steady, but faint. If anyone ever reads this, know that we did our part. We didn't ask for medals, just for the world to remember that we were there. Sarah stared at those words for a long time. Then she placed the letter under the scanner and whispered, "I remember." Months later, she submitted a proposal to the Army's historical branch to create a permanent online archive dedicated to the Women's Army Corps and female service members of World War II. She argued that too many of their stories were scattered, unnamed, lost between footnotes. Her commanding officer, a woman herself, approved it without hesitation. "About time," she said. When the archive launched 2 years later, it opened with a photograph, the one Sarah had found, and the caption, "They served behind the front lines, but the war moved because of them." Within months, thousands of families sent in their own photos and stories. Nurses, codebreakers, weather analysts, drivers, clerks. Women whose names had once been buried in filing cabinets now had faces again. At the dedication ceremony, Sarah stood before a small audience, veterans, historians, and descendants. She spoke simply, her voice steady. "My grandmother fixed engines. Her best friend fixed the lines that carried orders across continents. They were told their job was to support the war, but in truth, they sustained it. And without them, we might have lost far more than battles." After her speech, an elderly woman in a wheelchair approached her. Her name was Mary O'Donnell, one of the last surviving WACs who had served in London. "Your grandmother used to sneak chocolate bars into the radio hut," she said, smiling. "She said the sugar kept her fingers fast on the keys." Sarah laughed, blinking back tears. The woman reached out and held her hand, the grip still strong. "We didn't think anyone would remember," Mary whispered. "But you did. Bless you for that." Later that night, Sarah stood alone by the Potomac, watching the reflection of the Capitol shimmer in the dark water. The city had changed. Newer monuments, newer wars. But in the quiet hum of distant traffic, she thought she could still hear something softer beneath it. The faint tap of typewriter keys, the crackle of radio static, the rhythm of women working in half-lit rooms to hold the world together. She whispered into the wind, "We remember." The breeze shifted, carrying her words out over the water, toward the marble monuments and silent fields beyond. And somewhere, in the static of history, in the memory of metal and ink, it felt as though voices answered, the same ones who had stayed behind the front lines, unseen but unshaken, still watching over the generations that followed. For as long as soldiers marched and orders were given, their echoes would remain steady, patient, unbreakable. The women who typed, mended, coded, and cared would never fade again, because remembrance had finally become part of the line, as vital and enduring as the signal they once kept alive through the darkest nights of war. It was 2025, and the Pentagon's glass facades caught the morning sun like the surface of a still ocean. Inside, Captain Maya Thompson adjusted her uniform as she entered the Hall of Honor, a quiet corridor lined with photographs and plaques, chronicling nearly a century of American service. She had been invited to speak at a commemoration ceremony marking 83 years since the founding of the Women's Army Corps. She paused before one display. Beneath the glass, a faded typewriter sat beside a photograph of two women in khaki uniforms arms around each other, smiling like the war hadn't yet swallowed the world. The caption read, Corporal Eleanor Reed and Sergeant Ruth Lang, WAC Communications, European Theater, 1944. Maya had seen that photograph before. It appeared in the digital archive every military cadet now studied during training. Her grandmother had made her read it. These women, she'd said, they didn't just support the fight. They built the foundation you're standing on. Now, standing there in full-dress uniform, Maya felt the truth of those words press quietly against her heart. She'd served in cyber operations, the modern evolution of what Eleanor and Ruthie once did with radios and typewriters. Her battlefield was digital, her weapon a keyboard, her enemy unseen but just as dangerous. And yet, when she thought about those two women hunched over their machines in a tent in France, she realized they'd been fighting the same war. The one for precision, for truth, for lives depending on every correct signal. The ceremony began at 10. Rows of uniforms filled the room, men and women, officers and cadets, veterans and historians. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and respect. A retired colonel spoke first, recalling how the Women's Army Corps had faced skepticism, even ridicule when it was formed. They were told they didn't belong, he said. They proved the Army couldn't function without them. Then it was Maya's turn. She stepped up to the podium, heart steady but full. Her words came naturally, pulled from years of service and from the stories that had shaped her. In 1943, she began, a group of women marched into history wearing uniforms that the world wasn't ready to see them in. They didn't fire rifles or storm beaches, but they sent the orders that made those victories possible. They typed through bombings, drove through shell fire, coded through exhaustion. They didn't ask for glory. They just did the job. She paused, scanning the crowd. Young faces, eager, proud. When I log into a secure terminal, when I intercept a hostile transmission, when I lead a team of analysts, I think of them. Because everything we do began with them. They proved that service isn't defined by where you stand, but by what you're willing to carry. A quiet settled over the room. Then applause, long, respectful, rising from the back like a tide. Afterward, Maya lingered in the hallway. An elderly woman approached her. White hair, eyes clear, moving carefully with a cane. "Beautiful words, Captain," she said. "I was part of the Signal Corps in '49. We stood on their shoulders, you know." Maya smiled. "And I stand on yours," she said softly. The woman nodded, eyes glistening. "Then we did something right." Later that evening, Maya walked across the Arlington grounds. The sun was low, painting everything gold. She stopped at a familiar grave, Eleanor M. Reed, Women's Army Corps, 1921-1992. A small bouquet rested against the stone, fresh. Someone else had been here recently. She crouched down, brushing a bit of dust from the inscription. "You probably wouldn't believe what the world looks like now," she murmured. "We have women commanding entire divisions, piloting jets, running satellite networks. But we still follow your signal. You and the others? You left a map." A breeze moved gently through the rows of headstones, carrying the faint sound of footsteps and distant laughter. Maya could almost imagine voices riding on that wind. A pair of women talking over the hum of an old radio, keys clattering, words crossing oceans. She stood slowly, saluted, and turned back toward the city. The lights of Washington shimmered in the distance, alive with the pulse of everything those women had made possible. That night, as she sat at her desk writing her speech for the Cadet Academy, she ended it with a single line, one she didn't even have to think about. They served behind the front lines, but they pushed the world forward, and as she typed it, she smiled. Because in that moment, the line didn't just belong to her. It belonged to all of them. The women of the WAC, the nurses, the mechanics, the code breakers, the generations that followed. Every keystroke was a heartbeat, and the rhythm had never stopped. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere, a radio tower blinked red against the horizon. Somewhere, signals moved through the air, carrying messages, just like before. And if you listened closely, you could still hear it. The whisper of history made by women who never sought the spotlight, only the signal. The same women whose courage still hummed beneath every wire, every code, every uniform worn in their name. It was late evening, and the museum was nearly empty. The last echoes of footsteps faded down the marble hallway, leaving only the soft hum of the lights above. Captain Maya Thompson lingered in front of the final exhibit, the new edition she'd helped design. Inside the glass case was a single artifact, a weathered olive-drab typewriter. The plaque below it read, "Used by Corporal Eleanor Reed, Women's Army Corps Communications, European Theater, 1944. Donated by her family." Maya had seen it before, but tonight it felt different. The museum was quiet enough that she could almost imagine the clack of its keys, the rhythm of messages typed in urgency and hope. Behind the case, a screen played a slow reel of black and white photographs. Women in uniform, some smiling, some weary, all purposeful. Beneath each image, a simple line, "We served." The air smelled faintly of dust and history. Maya reached out and pressed her palm lightly against the glass. "You have no idea how far your signal traveled," she whispered. As she turned to leave, she noticed a young girl standing nearby, maybe 10 or 11, wearing a small Air Force hoodie. She was staring at the typewriter with wide, curious eyes. "Did people really use that?" she asked. Maya smiled. "They did, a long time ago. That machine sent messages across the world when the world was at war." The girl tilted her head. "Did your grandma use it?" Maya hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Not that one, but something like it. She worked with the women who did." The girl thought for a moment, her voice quiet. "I want to do what they did." Maya felt something stir deep inside her. The same quiet pride Eleanor must have felt once, watching the world change and knowing she'd helped push it forward. She knelt so she could meet the girl's eyes. "Then you already are," she said, "because they made it possible for you to even dream that." The girl smiled shyly, then waved as she walked off with her parents. Maya stayed a while longer, watching the looping film, faces flickering like ghosts of courage. In the reflection of the glass, she saw her own face overlap with Eleanor's and Ruthie's. 3 generations apart, but somehow standing in the same light. As she left the museum, the city night opened before her. The sound of cars, the hum of power lines, the soft blinking of towers in the distance. Somewhere far above, satellites orbited silently, carrying coded signals across continents. She looked up at the sky and thought of that invisible web. 1,000 new lines connecting people, ideas, and nations. It struck her then how much it all echoed the war rooms and wire huts of 1944. The same determination, the same hope transmitted through new machines, new generations. Later that night, she drove out to Arlington once more. The gates were closed, but the view from the hill stretched endlessly. The monuments glowing faintly, the river gleaming under the moon. She parked, rolled down the window, and sat in silence. "Eleanor Reed," she said softly into the night. "Ruth Lang, Mary O'Donnell, all of you, you didn't just serve. You built something that never broke." The breeze picked up again, whispering through the grass. It sounded like the faint crackle of static, radio noise from a world long gone but never truly silent. In that moment, Maya imagined them standing there, the women of the WAC, side by side, their uniforms pressed, their hair tied back, their faces young and determined. Eleanor holding her typewriter, Ruthie wiping grease from her hands, Mary smiling behind her radio headset. They weren't ghosts. They were signals. Signals that had traveled through time, through generations, through progress and pain still pulsing. Still heard, Maya closed her eyes and listened. And in the quiet, she swore she could hear them again. The steady rhythm of keys striking metal, messages flowing, voices woven into the heartbeat of a world they helped save. She smiled, whispered, "Message received," and started her car. The headlights washed softly over the stones as she drove away. A beam of light cutting through darkness, carrying their story forward, just as they once did, and somewhere, unseen but eternal, the line stayed open. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Maya's apartment, catching the edge of a photograph on her wall. A sepia portrait of 3 women in uniform, standing arm in arm, grinning at the camera. Beneath it, written in fading ink, London, 1944. To whoever comes after us, keep going. It had been Eleanor's handwriting. Maya had found it tucked in an old footlocker years ago, wrapped around a bundle of letters never sent. The note had haunted her ever since, not with sadness, but with a kind of responsibility. That morning, as she brewed coffee and stared at the photo, she realized the story wasn't finished. She'd spent years curating artifacts, telling other people's histories. But now, she wanted to trace it, to find the missing pieces. By noon, she was at the National Archives, her badge swinging from her neck. Rows of files stretched into shadows. The smell of old paper filled the air. Dry, warm, familiar. She slipped on her gloves, opened a box marked WAC, European Theatre, 1944-45, and began leafing through the contents. Reports, duty rosters, memos, and then a letter. It was addressed to Colonel Oveta Culp Hobby, the first director of the Women's Army Corps. Dated April 1945. The handwriting was neat, but hurried. The ink smudged by time. "Ma'am, this is Corporal Eleanor Reed. I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. We're stationed near the German border. The war feels close to ending, but the nights are still full of noise. I just wanted to say, thank you for giving us this chance. We've been told the men are tired, worn thin, and we do what we can. I type, I listen, I keep the lines alive. Sometimes I think no one will remember that part. The waiting, the listening, the quiet hours between the chaos. But maybe someday they will. Maybe someday someone will know we were here." Maya stared at the words for a long time. Her throat tightened. It wasn't just a letter. It was proof that the small acts, the invisible labor, the unseen courage, mattered. She turned the page over. On the back, someone had written later, in pencil, "Reed, KIA, April 17th, 1945. Mortar shell, Western Front." For a moment, the air seemed to still. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw Eleanor, not as a fading photo, but alive. The clatter of her typewriter, the hum of distant gunfire, the warmth of her voice calling out through the noise. Message sent. Maya left the archives just before sunset. The city buzzed around her, alive and noisy, but she felt something calm settle over her. A strange mix of grief and gratitude. That night, she sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began to type. Corporal Eleanor Reed served with the Women's Army Corps from 1942 to 1945. She operated field communications near the front lines, handling encoded transmissions that helped coordinate Allied movements. She was 23 when she died. She left behind no children, but her signal, her message, still travels. She paused. The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence. Waiting. Because of her and women like her, the world learned that courage has no uniform, and service has no gender. Maya saved the document and leaned back. Outside, the city lights flickered, and a plane crossed overhead. just a faint hum against the night sky. She watched it go, imagining the cables, the radios, the endless chain of human connection that stretched from that night in 1945 to this one. And somewhere, maybe in a museum, maybe in the quiet of memory, a typewriter key pressed itself once more, softly striking metal. A signal from another time, whispering through the years, we were here, we mattered, and we never stopped sending the message. A week later, Maya found herself standing on the steps of the Smithsonian, clutching a folder so worn the edges had begun to fray. Inside were Eleanor's letters, photographs, and field reports, tangible echoes of a woman history had almost forgotten. She had spent days assembling everything, nights blending old ink and new words into a proposal she'd titled simply, The Signal That Never Died, the untold story of the Women's Army Corps. It wasn't meant to be just another exhibit. She wanted to build an experience, one that let people feel what Eleanor, Ruth, and thousands of women like them had endured. The curator's assistant led her inside. "You've got 10 minutes," he whispered. 10 minutes. Maya smiled faintly. Eleanor had done more with less. The room was cold, full of glass tables and polished stone. At the head of the long table sat Dr. Laramie, the museum's senior historian, a sharp, silver-haired woman who had seen 1,000 proposals cross her desk. She adjusted her glasses and nodded. "Go ahead, Ms. Thompson. Tell me what you've got." Maya took a breath. "I want to tell a story," she began softly. "Not about generals or battles, but about connection, about the women who kept the lines alive when the world was breaking. The Women's Army Corps didn't just type memos or file reports. They translated chaos into communication. They held the system together, one message at a time." She spread out the photos. Eleanor at her typewriter, Ruth laughing beside a half-dismantled Jeep, Mary in a radio tent surrounded by static. The room fell quiet as the images caught the light. "They weren't behind the front lines," Maya continued. "They were the front line of information. Every decoded message, every repaired wire, every transmission. It mattered. These women carried the weight of trust in silence. And when they came home, most of them faded back into ordinary lives. But I think they deserve to be heard again. Dr. Laramie looked at the photograph of Eleanor, then up at Maya. "And what would this exhibit look like?" Maya leaned forward. "Not just displays, experience. Visitors walk through a reconstructed WASP communication post. Hear the sound of typewriters, Morse code, intercepted broadcasts. They read the letters, touch the uniforms, see the faces. They feel the pulse of connection, the heartbeat of a war fought not only with bullets, but with information." The curator's assistant glanced at Dr. Laramie, who hadn't said a word. Then the older woman reached for one of the letters. She read silently for a moment, Eleanor's final note. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "You knew her?" Maya shook her head. "No, but I think I'm here because of her." Dr. Laramie closed the folder carefully, then smiled. "Let's make sure no one forgets her again." 2 months later, the exhibit opened to the public. The line stretched around the block. Inside, the soft sound of clacking keys filled the air. People walked slowly through the dimly lit room, stopping to read messages projected on the walls. Real words from real women. We typed orders that moved divisions, but we couldn't order a cup of coffee in some towns. They told us to keep our voices down. We didn't. The war needed them. Every time the line stayed open, I felt like the world might stay open too. And there, at the center, in a glass case of her own, sat Eleanor's typewriter, restored, polished, but still bearing the faint dents of its years in service. Maya stood in the corner, watching visitors pause, lean in, and whisper to each other. Some cried quietly, others smiled. One little girl, maybe the same one from the museum months ago, pressed her hand against the glass, just as Maya once had. She whispered something Maya couldn't quite hear, but she didn't need to. She knew. Later that night, long after the doors closed and the lights dimmed, the museum was silent again. The motion sensors clicked off one by one, leaving only the faint glow of the exhibit's final display, a looping signal light, blinking in perfect rhythm. Dot. Dash. Pause. Maya watched it from the shadows before turning to leave. It was Morse code, the simplest message of all. Still here. Spring came soft and green to Virginia. The trees outside the museum had begun to bloom, their branches heavy with white petals that drifted in the wind like tiny parachutes. Maya drove with the windows down, a folder resting on the seat beside her. Not one of work this time, but of something personal. Eleanor Reed's family had been difficult to trace. The name was common, the records fragmented by time. But a note in one of the archives had led her to a small town in Ohio, and then to a nursing home by a quiet river, where one last Reed remained. When she arrived, the nurse led her down a long hallway that smelled faintly of lilacs and disinfectant. In a sunlit room at the end sat an elderly woman, thin and sharp-eyed despite her age. She wore a cardigan the color of faded sky. "Maya Thompson?" the woman asked, her voice warm but tired. "You've come about my sister." Maya nodded, suddenly unsure what to say. "Yes, ma'am. Eleanor Reed. I've been telling her story." The old woman smiled faintly. "Ellie. Lord, she was stubborn." She gestured toward a small photo frame on the table. The same face Maya knew so well, younger and bright-eyed in uniform. "They told us she was gone just before the war ended." Mama never believed it, said no one that alive could just disappear. Maya sat beside her. "She didn't disappear," she said softly. "She's in a museum now. People come from all over to see her work. Her typewriter, her letters. They read her words. They remember." The old woman blinked slowly, her eyes glistening. "After all these years?" "Yes," Maya whispered. "After all these years," the woman laughed quietly, a sound that trembled between sorrow and pride. "She'd like that. She always said the world was too loud to hear quiet voices. I guess she was wrong." Maya reached into her folder and pulled out a photograph. The museum display, Eleanor's typewriter gleaming under soft light, surrounded by people leaning close to read. She placed it gently in the woman's trembling hands. "She changed things," Maya said. "And now, people know." For a long time they sat in silence. The river outside shimmered in the afternoon sun. The old woman traced the edge of the photograph with her thumb. "Tell me," she said finally, "what made you care so much?" Maya smiled. "Because I think she was speaking to all of us, anyone who ever felt unseen. She didn't just send messages. She sent hope." The woman nodded. "That sounds like Ellie." She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. "Thank you for bringing her home." Maya left the nursing home an hour later. The sun was low, painting the water gold. She stood for a while by the riverbank, watching the ripples fade into the distance. The world was quiet, but not empty. It hummed softly, like an old transmission still traveling through air and memory. When she got back to her car, she pulled out her phone and opened the museum's live feed. The camera showed visitors still walking through the exhibit. The soft lights flickering, the typewriter gleaming like a heartbeat. In the corner of the frame, the Morse light still blinked its endless message. Dot. Dash. Pause. "Still here." Maya smiled and whispered, loud and clear. Then she drove away, following the long road that wound beside the river, the petals drifting across her windshield like snow. The radio crackled faintly, then settled into music. Something distant, old, and hopeful. Behind her, in a museum filled with echoes and glass, a single light blinked steadily in the dark. The unbroken rhythm of memory, courage, and every quiet voice that ever refused to fade. And in that rhythm, Somewhere between silence and signal, the women of the WAC still worked, eternal, unseen, and unforgettable, keeping the lines alive. Keeping the lines alive.